Like in a nightmare, so many things went wrong here on so many levels. But why? What actually happened? Stay tuned. I often get asked which the safest and least safe airline in the world is, and I always answer the same thing. All airlines are forced to follow very similar standards, so as long as they are allowed to operate, they are all safe. But there are some out there who definitely get into more accidents than others, and one of them is the Colombian airline Aerosucre. This is a cargo airline that has been serving less developed parts of Colombia since all the way back in 1969. And they have done so using a fleet that has varied over the years, but now consists of several Boeing 727s as well as 737-200s, 300s and 400s. Since it was founded, Aerosucre has had 11 fatal accidents and many more non-fatal ones, meaning that the airline has actually written off significantly more airplanes over its history than it has ever owned at any given time. For example, back in 1989, 5 crew and 2 people on the ground died when an Aerosucre Caravelle suffered a load shift, lost control and then crashed into several houses. And later that same year, another Aerosucre flight flew straight into a mountain, killing 6 people. Then in 1991, 2 persons died and several were injured when an Aerosucre DC-6 landed short of the runway in Barranquilla, and that flight, which was supposed to be a pure cargo flight, turned out to also be carrying at least 19 unauthorized passengers who had all gotten handwritten tickets through relatives that worked with the company. And these poor passengers had, according to reports, been sitting on the floor of the cargo area next to some crates of newspapers during the crash, since there were no seats fitted. Later, another deadly accident took place in 2006 when an Aerosucre 727 on approach hit a radio tower, killing all 6 crew members on board. And if that wasn't enough, they have also written off quite a few aircraft due to landing gear collapses. Plus, they've had a number of other emergencies, like in 2021 when the cargo door of the 737 came open in flight. Now, it is important to keep in mind that throughout most of Aerosucre's existence, Colombia has been embroiled in a long-running civil war that strained its infrastructure and oversight, so it wasn't always easy to operate safely, even if they were trying. And that's a big if. Now, despite their poor safety record, Aerosucre provides a vital service to some remote towns and cities in Colombia that would otherwise struggle to maintain supplies of basic goods or be unable to export their local products to market. And for that reason, Aerosucre's longtime owner was actually given a state award in 2013 for service to the country. But 2 years after receiving that award, he himself nearly died in a plane crash where he was pilot flying. Anyway, this is just supposed to give you some background, which might make the story that I'm about to tell you a bit easier to understand. And for that story, we need to go back to the 20th of December of 2016. On that day, an Aerosucre Boeing 727 and its crew were scheduled to operate a round trip between El Dorado International Airport in Bogotá to Germán Otano Airport in the remote town of Puerto Carreño, situated in the far eastern part of the country. Puerto Carreño is located along the Orinoco River, which forms part of Colombia's border with Venezuela, and Germán Otano Airport is actually surrounded by Venezuelan territory on 3 sides. When the inbound flight arrived at the airport, they flew the approach from the Colombian side, using runway 07, like most aircraft who use this airport tends to do, and that's an issue that I'll get back to later. Anyway, after the aircraft landed at 14:48 local time, the crew then supervised the ground personnel as they unloaded 9,300 kilograms of perishable foods and sundries to resupply the town. That was then followed by the loading of 9 pallets containing 19,800 kilograms of local products going for export, meaning that the crew knew that they would be substantially heavier on the homebound flight than they had been when they arrived. But who were the crew members who were operating on this afternoon then? Well, we don't actually know that much about them, except that they were supposed to be 5 crew members on board: a captain, a first officer, a flight engineer, a mechanic, and finally a loadmaster. The captain was 58 years old and had 8,708 total flying hours, including 6,822 hours on the Boeing 727. But he was the only crew member whose full records were actually available. The first officer was 39 years old, and according to Aerosucre's company records, he had 3,285 hours, all of which had been flown on the Boeing 727, but there were no record of any experience he might have gained before joining the company. Lastly, the flight engineer was 72 years old and had 1,612 hours on the Boeing 727 at Aerosucre, but again, there was no information about what he had done before that, and he had joined Aerosucre in 2013, 3 years before this flight, so he almost certainly had extensive experience with previous employers given his age. And when we're on the subject of his age, the fact that he was 72 years old might surprise a few of you guys out there, since pilots normally retire by either 60 or 65 years old. Well, it turns out that in a lot of countries, there actually is no age limit for flight engineers, and even in the places where there is a limit, it's often much higher than it is for pilots. In fact, in the United States, it used to be somewhat common for captains who had aged out of the left seat to become flight engineers so that they could keep flying for a couple of more years. But having said that, 72 definitely makes him the oldest flight engineer that I've ever heard of in active duty. As for the mechanic and the loadmaster, we don't know anything about them at all, and that's likely because their roles didn't make much of a difference to the outcome of this story. Interestingly though, while the flight was only supposed to have 5 crew members, a 6th person was later found to have been on board, and the sources we have looked at doesn't say who that person was. But it might have been an undocumented passenger, since Aerosucre had, like I mentioned earlier, a history of carrying those. Now, while we are on the subject of sources, I want to take this opportunity to give a real shout out to today's sponsor, NordVPN. You see, when we're researching these videos, specifically incidents that have happened on other continents, we frequently run into geo-blocked content, which is super frustrating. But with the help of NordVPN, we can quickly change our virtual location and bypass these restrictions, giving us full access to what we need. I also use it to be able to see some Swedish TV programs from back home, and it works just like a charm. I just love things that work like advertised. Awesome. But Nord is not just about breaking down digital barriers. They now also have added some truly great cybersecurity tools, which of course includes encryption and securing of your personal information, whether you're browsing, streaming or shopping online. You can also use Nord to save some money on flights, rental cars and hotels by trying to book from different locations, but remember to clear your cache before trying that. If this sounds good and you want to try Nord out for yourself, well, then I have a fantastic offer for you. If you sign up for their 2-year plan using my link below, which is nordvpn.com/pilot, you'll get 4 extra months absolutely free. And with their 30-day money-back guarantee, you don't risk anything by trying. So remember, nordvpn.com/pilot. Thank you, Nord. Now let's get back to the story. The aircraft they were operating on this day was a 41-year-old beautiful 3-engine Boeing 727-200, which had been originally manufactured back in 1975. It had then been operated for many years in the United States before it was retired in 2007. At which point Aerosucre bought it and re-registered it in Colombia, possibly to replace one of the company's other 727s that had crashed a year earlier. Then in 2015, Aerosucre modified this aircraft according to a third-party retrofit package called Quiet Wing, which came with a supplemental type certificate, basically an addition to the original Boeing 727 type specifications approved by the FAA. The idea behind the Quiet Wing was to reduce the amount of noise generated during takeoff and landing and also to improve its performance. This was done in part by adding new takeoff flap settings which would allow the 727 to take off from shorter runways using lower speeds and therefore requiring less engine power and fuel. On the standard 727, the maximum takeoff flap setting was 25 degrees, but with the Quiet Wing modifications, it now became possible to also take off with flaps 30. Now the flap settings that we pilots choose to use affects how we determine the takeoff or V speeds, that is V1, the decision speed, VR, rotation speed, and V2, the safe engine out speed. Generally speaking, the higher the flap setting, the lower these speeds will become, since the wings will be able to provide more lift and therefore allow the aircraft to get airborne earlier. But with the addition of flaps 30, this also meant that the flight crew needed a new set of tables in order to determine these V speeds, tables taking weight, temperature and wind into account. The designers of the quiet wing modification had provided a supplement to the aircraft flight manual that included instructions for how to calculate these new V-speeds with flaps 30, which Aerosucre should have used to then develop new quick reference takeoff cards for its pilots. These cards allow the pilots to quickly reference the required takeoff speeds without having to flip through pages and pages in the performance manuals and pore over complicated charts. But Aerosucre had never made these new takeoff cards, so the only way that the pilots could determine the correct flap 30 V-speed was by examining those charts in the manuals, which was pretty inconvenient on a daily basis. Now, to me, as someone who flies in a well-regulated environment, it's almost inconceivable that an airline would fail to do something that basic. But not only did Aerosucre fail to do this, apparently Colombia's Civil Aviation Authority didn't exercise any oversight of the modification process at all, even though they signed off on it, meaning that they also failed to catch this obvious error. But that wasn't the only major problem with Aerosucre's 727 operation into Germán Olano Airport. Because it turns out that they actually never had permission to fly this particular aircraft in there in the first place. You see, the runway width and pavement strength at the airport were both below the minimum values required for the Boeing 727, so it wasn't actually legal to conduct routine 727 operations there at all. Now, like any airline, Aerosucre had to acquire operational authorization from the civil aviation authorities for the relevant country, in this case Colombia, for every aircraft type and route combination that they intended to fly. But the operational authorization document approved by Colombia's CAA clearly specified that only Boeing 737 operations were permitted at Germán Olano Airport. And despite this, Aerosucre just ignored that and started flying there with its 727s anyway. And not only that, before every flight, the airline submitted a flight plan to the CAA for air traffic control purposes. And these flight plans seem to have then been just approved, apparently without any checking which aircraft type was actually being used. Now, neither the runway width nor the pavement strength was a factor in this accident, but obviously, if the regulations had been properly enforced, this flight would have never taken place, and this accident would therefore have been prevented. It is worth pointing out here that aviation is as safe as it is today because we build safety margins into every part of the operation. That ethos is supposed to start at the international level and then move down through the national regulators out to the airlines and then finally to the operating crews through laws, regulations, procedures and training. When this works well, there are so much margins in there that a singular or even several errors can slip through without something really bad happening. But when these rules are ignored, then the margins are thinned out until finally it comes down to a singular human mistake. After the cargo was loaded, the crew of Aerosucre Flight 157 carried out their pre-flight checks and then started up the 727's 3 Pratt & Whitney JT8 Delta engines. Once they were up and running, that also activated the cockpit voice recording, which means that we know what was said in the cockpit from that point onwards. The time was now 1700 and the control tower had actually closed for the day at 1500, meaning that the airport was now uncontrolled. So, to let other aircraft know their intentions, the first officer sent out a blind message addressed to all aircraft in the Puerto Carreño area on the common terminal frequency. And he stated Flight 157's intention to taxi to the active runway via taxiway Bravo. The pilots then completed their standard control checks and also double-checked the takeoff items, including flaps, which they had set to the maximum 30 degrees in order to help them take off from the short, 1,800 meter long runway. They also reviewed the previously calculated engine power settings, or EPRs, and the captain then called out a value of 23 for both V1 and VR. He likely meant 123 knots here, but the first officer corrected him to 127 knots, which is what they had calculated before. After accepting that, the captain, who was going to be pilot flying for the leg, then conducted a takeoff briefing in which he explained that the flight engineer would add takeoff power, the first officer would then call out 60 and 80 knots, then V1 and VR at 127 knots, and finally V2 at 141 knots. He also discussed who would monitor the instruments and what they would do in the event of an engine failure, both before and after decision speed, so far, so good. Now, there are 3 things about this briefing that is worth pointing out before we continue. The first is that the V-speeds they were using corresponded to an aircraft weight of 75,300 kilos, but the cargo and fuel information suggested that the weight of the aircraft was only 74,200 kilos, a full 1.1 ton less. Based on the runway length and the outside temperature of 31 degrees Celsius, the maximum takeoff weight for this runway would have been 74,700 kilos, which was higher than the aircraft's actual weight calculated by investigators. But it was apparently very common for Aerosucre to overload its aircraft with extra cargo that wasn't on the manifest in order to make the takeoff weight appear to be within limits. So the crew possibly used V-speeds corresponding to 75,300 kilos in order to account for this. It's hard to know for sure. Now, the higher V-speeds resulting from using this higher weight would have slightly extended the takeoff roll, but it was still possible to take off even with a 600 kilo overweight. But here we come to the second problem, because it turns out that the speeds selected by the crew were actually for a flaps 25 takeoff and not a flaps 30 takeoff. This was probably because, remember, Aerosucre hadn't updated the takeoff cards for flaps 30, so the pilots were just using the flaps 25 speeds from the old takeoff cards instead. Now, this should be safe since those speeds were actually higher, but if the crew would have used the correct V-speeds here, then the V1 and VR speeds would have been 122 instead of 127 knots, allowing them to rotate 5 knots sooner. Investigators later calculated that in the time required to accelerate these extra 5 knots, the aircraft would eat up an extra 103 meters of runway, which on a runway that's short isn't really something they could afford. Now, the next thing I want to note about the captain's takeoff briefing is what wasn't in it. A takeoff briefing should include discussions of the runway in use, possibly the weight, but definitely the existing weather conditions and wind. At the time the aircraft was taxiing out, the runway in use for takeoff was runway 07, since the wind was out of the northeast. But at this point, the crew hadn't discussed the weather conditions at all. In fact, on this day, Aerosucre's dispatch department never provided Flight 157 with any weather information at all before departure, and the tower was, like I mentioned, closed. So as the pilots were taxiing out towards runway 25, the opposite runway than the one that was in use, the captain actually asked, don't know what the wind is, but none of the other crew members even acknowledged him. A few moments later he asked, but it's light, yes or no? To which the first officer replied, yeah, it is light. Apparently, the pilots had decided, without much data to back it up, that the wind was light enough that they didn't even have to take it into account, even though there was a weather office that they could have called in order to get the actual wind information. Now, this is the attitude that most of us have when we're out driving our cars. Maybe we'll glance outside before we go to see if it's sunny, raining or snowing, and then we might modify our driving style a little bit depending on what we see, but that's about it. Most of the time that's absolutely fine, but sometimes we end up in a ditch and we need a tow because it was just a little bit more slippery than we thought. In an aircraft though, we just can't afford to operate that way. Remember what I said about margins earlier on? We should always make sure that we have the margins with us and not against us. So when we fly, we have to be super diligent with all details, like the wind. In this case, there was a 4-knot wind out of northeast, which slightly favored runway 07 for takeoff instead of runway 25, which the crew were now going for. Now 4 knots isn't a lot, but when you are an overweight 727 taking off from a 1,800 meter runway with V-speeds that are too high, it just means again smaller margins. The pilots likely noticed that there was a light tailwind from runway 25 because they taxied past a windsock on their way out to the takeoff position, but that didn't change their minds. Now there are a few factors that I think could possibly have contributed to that decision. You see, taking off from runway 07 wasn't as simple as using runway 25, not only because it pointed away from the destination, but also because of the proximity to the Venezuelan border, located only 2.8 kilometers away from the departure end of runway 07. Now, I can't say for sure whether there were any airspace restrictions or anything like that, but flight radar data shows that most flights using Germán Molano Airport do take off from runway 25, and the few that uses runway 07 often execute a very sharp turn right after takeoff, likely to minimize entry into Venezuela. It's quite possible that entering Venezuelan airspace requires some extra paperwork or communication with air traffic control, which the pilots could have been aware of. Now, 2 other aircraft did take off from runway 07 shortly before Flight 157 departed, but these were a Cessna 208 and an Embraer 170, which are much smaller and more maneuverable, and could therefore probably have made a turn that the heavier 727 just would not be able to do. In any case, whatever the reason was, the crew was probably used to taking off from runway 25 unless the tailwind was very strong, so as long as they perceived it to be light, they likely didn't worry too much about it. But investigators later calculated that 4-knot tailwind would add another 146 meters to the takeoff distance, so things were now starting to add up. After completing the before takeoff checklist, the pilots taxied up to the head of runway 25 and then made a 180-degree turn, during which the first officer again announced their intentions over the common frequency. As soon as they were lined up, the captain called for takeoff thrust to be set, and the flight engineer advanced the thrust levels to the predetermined EPRs. So at time 17:18, they started accelerating down the runway. At this point, local plane spotters had gathered at the far end of the runway to watch the sleek 727 takeoff, and it was no coincidence that they were there to watch this particular flight. Aerosucre had a history of dramatic takeoffs from this particular runway, where on multiple occasions their 727s and 737s had been filmed making very long takeoff rolls, overflying plane spotters by just a few meters. And on at least 2 of these occasions, the aircraft had also nearly struck the 2-meter-high perimeter fence located 60 meters past the runway end, as well as a tree and a military guard post 76 meters further downrange. These earlier passes had been so close that they had enveloped the plane spotters in clouds of dust and left the tree branches swaying. So, for some of the enthusiasts positioned right at the end of runway 25, this was probably a bit of a thrill-seeking adventure. And they ended up getting way more than they had bargained for. I also want to add here that the placement of that fence, tree and guard post also didn't comply with international obstacle clearance regulations, since they penetrated into something known as the protected takeoff area. This area is defined by a specific slope starting from the runway end, and any obstacle that penetrates this slope has to be either removed or shortened, or if that can't be done, they must be mentioned on the airport charts and included in the aircraft's takeoff performance calculations. But here, none of that had been done, which again highlights the Colombian Civil Aviation Authority's lack of proper enforcement, as well as another safety margin removed. Anyway, the existence of multiple videos of aircraft nearly striking these obstacles also says a lot about Aerosucre's operations. Since their planes had been filmed nearly overrunning this very same runway at least twice, we have to ask ourselves why, and how many times that this has happened without it being caught on camera. Every aircraft must be able to pass the departure and runway at a minimum altitude of 35 feet, even after an engine failure, but that was clearly being routinely violated here. This leads me to believe that the excess weight, wrong V-speeds and disregard for the weather were probably also present on countless previous flights, leading flight crews to become accustomed to operating with little or maybe even no margin for error. I can see how it can be tempting to dismiss the significance of 600 kilos here, 5 knots difference in rotation speed there, a 4-knot tailwind here, but the problem is that these little variations are only academic until they suddenly aren't. Now, even with these factors in place, Flight 157 should still have been able to become airborne just before the end of the runway, and if that would have happened, we probably wouldn't be talking about this flight right now. But unfortunately, there was still one last thing that tipped them over the edge. Remember that one human mistake? As the 727 began to accelerate down the runway, the first officer soon called out, "Speed alive," and then 60 knots. The captain replied, "Check," followed by the first officer calling out 80 knots and also reaffirming that the decision and rotation speed were both at 127 knots. 12 seconds later, the first officer called out, V1, rotate, and the captain began to rotate the aircraft, but he did so very, very slowly. The standard rotation rate on the Boeing 727 is about 2 to 3 degrees per second until the aircraft gets airborne at around 8 to 10 degrees. But here, the captain rotated at only 1 degree per second, less than half of the proper rate, and that effectively doubled the time required to reach the takeoff angle. During that time, the aircraft consumed another 134 meters of extra runway, only now they didn't have those 135 meters to spare. 7 seconds after the rotation call, Flight 157 ran off the end of the paved runway with its nose in the air and just barely becoming airborne as it crossed a short stretch of grass. But it was now far too late to avoid those other obstacles at the end of the runway. The rear fuselage soon crushed the airport perimeter fence as the airplane streaked across the road where the plane spotters now desperately threw themselves out of the way. And through some miracle, none of them were actually hurt. The airplane then continued its trajectory forward where it struck both a tree and the guard post with its right main landing gear, right trailing edge flaps, and the number 3 engine, raising a huge cloud of dust and scattered debris as it did so. Despite these impacts and the massive damage it caused, the airplane then started climbing with several alarms and warnings blaring in the cockpit. Now, the cockpit voice recorder cut out for about 10 seconds right after the impact, so we don't know exactly what the pilot's initial reaction was to the collision. But when it came back online, the captain exclaimed, "Number 3 went! Engine 3, brother!" The first officer asked to confirm that engine number 3 had actually failed, and the captain confirmed that, yeah, that's what he meant. But the total extent of the damage to the aircraft was much worse than the pilots probably realized. Not only had the number 3 engine on the right side ingested loads of debris and therefore failed, but one of the right trailing edge flaps had also been completely removed, and the entire right main landing gear, with its door still attached, had been entirely torn off and thrown more than 400 meters away from the point of impact. The loss of the right main landing gear was especially devastating because it severed hydraulic lines belonging to both of the 727's redundant hydraulic system A and B, which now quickly started losing pressure. Now you might ask how it was possible that damage to one landing gear could end up depleting both hydraulic systems, but this had to do with the fact that whilst the landing gear retraction was handled by hydraulic system A alone, the brakes were handled primarily by system B. And it is hard to design a system with redundancy for entire airplane parts being ripped off. So the aircraft was now climbing, but in a very precarious state, with the partial loss of lift on the right wing, loss of thrust on the right engine, and rapidly depleting hydraulic pressures. As the aircraft struggled to gain altitude, the ground proximity warning system repeatedly started announcing "Caution, terrain," and the captain soon suggested that they should turn around for an immediate landing, even though they were well over maximum landing weight. Now, thinking about a plan is generally a good idea, but they were nowhere near that stage in their decision making. Instead, here it was all about keeping the aircraft in the air, aviating in other words. The first officer now tried to raise the gear, and it turns out that there actually was enough pressure left to raise the remaining bogies, but the right gear obviously indicated unsafe since it was no longer attached to the airplane. When he saw that, the first officer called out, "Right gear!" But at the same time, the captain also said, "Shut down engine number 3, whilst the flight engineer called out, "I lost hydraulic A." This was a truly chaotic, nightmare situation, and when faced with something like this, something known as short-term decision-making is put to the test. That's when there isn't enough time to reach for checklists or fully discuss what's going on. Instead, the actions need to be prioritized and executed based on experience, training, and technical knowledge. But if any of those are lacking, like in this case where the crew was faced with multiple failures likely never seen together in a training scenario, panic can very quickly start to set in, and when there is panic, bad decisions will be taken. As the captain tried to figure out what to do next, the first officer suggested that they lower the gear again, and without almost any hesitation, the captain just agreed. Now, this course of action really makes no sense if you think about it. with the airplane struggling to climb due to the loss of lift and thrust, the last thing you want is to extend the landing gear, since that would immediately increase the drag and make it even harder to maintain the safe airspeed and keep the airplane under control. But given the captain's very fast reaction to the first officer's suggestion, it seems likely that putting the gear back down was a panicked response to the unsafe gear indication and not something that the pilots actually took some time to analyze before doing. And this action would definitely make things much worse for them, as we will soon see. By the time the gear was now lowered again, almost all of the hydraulic fluid had been lost from both the main hydraulic systems. The Boeing 727 has backup manual control cables for the elevators, ailerons and pitch trim, but these require the pilots to move them using muscle power, and that requires a lot of strength for every input. On top of that, the 727's rudder doesn't have a cable-operated backup. Instead, it's powered by both main hydraulic systems, as well as a third, independent standby system that can be activated by flipping the standby rudder switch on the aft overhead panel. In the event of an engine failure, we pilots know that the first important thing to do is to use the rudder to cancel out the yawing movement caused by the asymmetric thrust. But, of course, what they were now facing was no ordinary engine failure. Since the right main gear had been removed, causing the total loss of both main hydraulic systems, this now meant that the normal redundancy for the rudder control had been completely lost. This in turn meant that the airplane now started yawing towards the failed right engine as the asymmetric thrust pushed the nose that way, and the normal counteraction of this movement using the left rudder was made impossible, unless the flight engineer would activate that standby rudder switch. If he would have done so, it would have been theoretically possible to get the plane back under control and maybe even make an emergency landing at a later point. But unfortunately, amid the chaos and panic, this never happened, and I actually don't really blame him. Like I said before, this was a scenario none of them would have ever seen before, and activating that switch would have formed part of an emergency checklist that normally would have been done after having properly identified the malfunction, something that they just didn't have time to do in this scenario. And now, since the landing gear was down, causing loads of extra drag, the airplane also started to lose its speed, and at lower speeds, control authority from the flight controls have reduced even more. The captain tried to keep the wings level by using the ailerons, but the yaw was still getting worse, and since their speed was now also dropping, he was losing aileron authority. As he fought to maintain control, the first officer applied maximum power on the remaining engines, while both pilots called for each other to fly it gently. The airplane climbed to a maximum altitude of 790 feet, at which point its speed had just dropped too much and it now started descending instead. This caused multiple terrain warnings to again blare out in the cockpit, and the captain also warned that they were on the verge of stalling. Meanwhile, the flight engineer frantically began to try to dump fuel to reduce the weight of the airplane, but it was too late for that, since to dump fuel in any meaningful amount takes a lot of time that they just didn't have. The fuel jettison valves still opened up and the fuel started pouring out from the wings, but it really didn't help. As the airplane now embarked on a slow descending right-hand turn, the captain exclaimed that the plane wasn't accelerating, and he now also asked the first officer to raise the landing gear again, likely finally realizing that in their initial panic they had made a very bad mistake in extending it. But of course, when the first officer tried to raise the gear, it wouldn't come back up, since there was now no hydraulic fluid left to lift it. It was likely at this point it became clear they were both out of time and out of options. Impact was now imminent. The pilots started engaging in panicked back and forth discussions about raising or lowering the gear, even though there was nothing that they could do about it. And as that was happening, the stick shaker had now also started rattling away, confirming the captain's earlier comments about the aircraft being close to a stall. But the captain kept trying desperately to remain airborne, despite insufficient airspeed and a still worsening yaw, now just a few dozen meters above the ground. Seconds later, the speed finally became so low that it couldn't support flight with this increasing bank angle. The aircraft stalled, meaning an uncontrolled loss of lift, which caused a final steep bank over to the right and straight into the ground, within viewing distance from the airport. And the entire flight had at this point lasted only 2 minutes and 23 seconds. Now, the aircraft impacted with its nose and right wing first, causing it to immediately roll over inverted before both wings separated and the cockpit snapped off. A large explosion then consumed most of the wreckage as the fuel load completely combusted, and the severed cockpit came to a rest away from the flames, but even though that was the case, 4 out of the people on board had died instantly from the impact forces, and 1 succumbed to his injuries later at the hospital. But the mechanic actually managed to survive, and despite suffering serious injuries, he was somehow able to escape from the wreckage, where he was soon assisted by bystanders and rescuers. Colombia's accident investigation group concluded that the causes of the accident were inadequate flight planning by the crew and the airline, improper decision-making by the flight crew, and the captain's improper rotation technique. The illegal use of a 727 at an unapproved airport, the airline's failure to modify the takeoff cards, the excessive weight, the lax oversight from the Civil Aviation Authority, and the crew's failure to activate the standby rudder hydraulic system were all cited as contributing factors. But while the flight crew made several serious mistakes here, it's also obvious that this accident could likely only have taken place within the dangerously lax operating culture at Aerosucre. The investigators therefore made several recommendations, mostly just suggesting that Aerosucre should comply with basic regulations and that the Civil Aviation Authority should actually enforce them, which seems like a pretty low bar to reach if you ask me. But if there is one thing that I want everyone to take away from this video, whether you're a pilot, an airline manager, or you work in some other industry where safety is important, it's this. If you start to recognize frequent omissions or little breaches of procedures, even if they don't seem all that significant at the moment, it's a sign that the holes in the Swiss cheese are now growing bigger. If that kind of culture is allowed to last long enough, then an accident becomes not only possible but almost inevitable. Margins are there to minimize the impact of unforced errors, and if they are taken away or ignored, eventually bad things will happen. Now, this video was made possible partly by the supporting members of my Patreon crew, who makes it possible for me to hire new team members and expand into even bigger and better productions. If you enjoy this content, you can join us as well using the link in the description below, which is patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.